Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about trends. It's so interesting because especially in anti-racism work, it's really interesting seeing the holding the contrast between talking to my parents and my grandparents and knowing that I stand on the shoulders of giants and that I don't have to endure what they had to endure. The opportunities that I have, they didn't have. And on the one end, we've seen so much progress. But then at the same time, talking to my parents and grandparents and them saying things like, in all my years, it's never been like this. I've never seen it like this. I never thought that it could happen like this. And so I'm always trying to hold is, how much have things changed for the better? How much have things kind of changed for the worse? And how much have things just stayed the same, just morphed, right? And there are so many different scenarios that can play out in if I try to land in a certain place. But where I'm at now is I'm like, it's like supremacist culture to think in this either or situation. And more so, I'm trying to embrace this both and situation where in ways things have gotten better, in ways things have gotten worse, and in ways things have morphed. And so what I always say is, I'm gonna do the best that I can to work towards change, towards the good. But if it can't happen, if it's just not meant to be, if things are going down, I'm gonna go out fighting. And so when I think about when I think about how to have a positive approach then to working towards good, some of the things that bubble up are recognizing the fact that the label of justice looks different now. That before, I think there was such a hard fight for just equality because by law, there were things that people could not do. And some of that, once again, is the same now. By law, there are some really unjust things out there, but it was easy to mobilize around people being able to vote, people, Jim Crow ending, that sort of thing. And now it's sort of like an energy that's out there of recognizing how in the past inequality has set things up so that there is not equity, right? That this is beyond understanding that everybody has the same rights to what are people's starting points and playing fields and what was the history behind those being different and how do we address that. But then separately, like I'm such a believer that so much of this otherizing, that's this lack of humanity has been such a driver of so much of a divide where we aren't existing as a world together, but more so thinking that there's an us versus them mentality, that there's a scarcity rather than that there's enough for everybody, that everybody's sort of against each other. And I feel like in recent times, we've seen how a divide can thus relate to so much harm. And I'm also a believer in political correctness when it comes to terminology, right? Because I think political correctness is something that people in their privilege have to think about. Admittedly, one thing that I'm really working on is in being cisgendered and straight is my language around making sure that I'm inclusive of our LGBTQ siblings, right? And I've been called out on, despite intention, saying things sometimes that aren't meant to cause harm, but ultimately do cause harm, or ultimately haven't been considerate around how someone non-binary could respond to me saying, hey, brothers and sisters, right? And so there's all this fight around political correctness that seems like not such a big deal, but what we have to realize is that the implications of that are that people in their privilege are not wanting to have to think about how what we say impacts people, and thus not want to think about how an aspect of what we do impacts people. And so I actually believe if we could be intentional about trying to be politically correct, that could open up a lot in regards to this divide, in regards to this idea of humanizing people, because we're just turning the light on to always trying to think about how someone else might feel and how what we're doing could impact that on small and large scales. Because before, people would say, like, people can think stuff and say stuff as long as they don't do anything, we're fine. And yes, it's worse to kill someone than it is to say something hurtful. But I'm seeing a correlation now between sort of people feeling more free to speak hatefully, and thus that allowing them to feel like they can do stuff more hatefully. And it's all really important to recognize. So if we're going to work in the right direction, I think that we have to be intentional about trying to see the human in people, listening to understand as opposed to judge, right? Thinking about what does it look like for us to show up in the world every day as our best selves possible, and realize that there are opportunities every day to work on self, to evaluate what we're a part of. And also someone brought this up, that sometimes we can be so intentional about focusing on the fight, focusing on the dismantling, that we're not thinking about what we're trying to build, right? And so that always has to come hand in hand. That what needs to go, what can stay, and what goes, what are we building? And I think that's what's hard for people, especially in like a supremacist culture, is that we focus so much on the fight, and we're trying to build something that we've never experienced before. And so you have to almost train your mind into that new way of thinking, that centering those who know what needs to be built, but also like this building mentality is, I think, how I stay positive. That if I'm just like dismantle or the world goes down, then then that's the pessimism. But if I'm like dismantle the harm, so that ultimately I can dream and build towards this dream, that's the North Star once again.